recovery housing series called the Recovery Housing Institute. I know many of you may have participated in some of our previous sessions that we've had on NIMBY issues and on the social model of recovery. These trainings are designed as a series, so each of them, can be taken and covering lots of different topics that are very helpful for people who are seeking to either start recovery housing or looking at their existing recovery housing and having their programs meet the national quality standards. But of course, if you haven't attended our previous sessions, that's okay. Each one is also designed to stand on its own and provide information on its own sets of objectives. I would just like to encourage you that if you're joining us today, please check out the other options that are in the series, because if you're interested in today's topic, you will likely also be interested in those topics. And so for today's session, it's going to be the first one where that's a little bit different from the others. And really what sets us apart from a lot of other trainings that we have is that there's an option to perform an assignment at the end. So you will have an option to download some of the handouts that are in the handout section and complete, your house rules and your resident rights statement and have them turned in to Ohio Recovery Housing. You'll get an email address where you can turn those in, and then we'll review them and provide you with feedback. And so if you attend the entire institute and you complete all of the assignments when they're offered as a part of the series, at the end of the institute, you will have a completed packet that will be ready to submit for ORA certification for your application. So if ORA certification is something that you're interested in for your program, if you're just starting out, or even if you're an existing operator and you're really interested in certification, please attend these training series, turn in all of the assignments, incorporate all of the feedback, and then your packet will be complete when you go to turn in your application for certification, and you will have a much smoother application process. And so you can download the assignment for today's training in the handout section. And if you look, I'm going to skip a slide here. So you can see on your GoToWebinar screen, there's a question box, and then below the questions, there are handouts. And so you can download the worksheets that are available for today's training to help you with your homework assignment. You can download a copy of the slides, and you can also download a copy of the Recovery Housing Development Guidebook that I'm going to be referring to throughout today's training as well. And then also, as much as possible, we really try to make these trainings interactive. And so we have some poll questions for you throughout the training today, as well as times where I'm going to be asking you questions. And then you can also type your responses into the question box, and I will see those. And that'll just be a way for us to kind of try to simulate in-person interaction as much as we can in this virtual environment. So please do participate, and we hope to keep you as engaged as possible. And so today's session focuses on appropriate language for policies and procedures in recovery housing. And so first, we're going to take a look at recovery-oriented language and how it can help you implement the social model within your recovery home. And then next, we're going to be talking about house rules and code of conduct and resident rights statements, what they are, why they're important, and how to implement them in accordance with the social model of recovery. And so to start out with, I have a poll question for you. So let me just pull up the poll here. There it is. And so you can go ahead and select your response to the answer to this question. I have been made uncomfortable in the past because of the words someone used to describe me or someone else. And you can select yes or no. I'm just going to give you 15 seconds to complete that poll. Okay, so I'm sharing the results now, and it looks like 88% of people said yes. Yes, they have been in a situation in the past where someone has used words that has made them uncomfortable. Either those words were about them or about someone else that they care about, or just someone else who is present. So it's a very common experience. Now, for many of us, that experience, who have had that experience, it was really uncomfortable. And that shows us that the words that we choose to use, either when we're speaking or when we're writing, do matter. And I really like this quote here that's on the screen. And yes, words matter. They may reflect reality, but they also have the power to change reality, the power to uplift and to abase. And this quote reminds me that words have power. And sometimes, when we're using different words or somebody says something that makes us uncomfortable, makes someone else uncomfortable, we hear the phrase, well, I'm just being honest, or it's the truth. And we all know that there are many ways to be honest and truthful in our words. We have the ability to use our words in ways that can reflect reality, and then in a way that reflects reality that either uplifts someone or to bring someone down. And so there are definitely ways where we can be honest and truthful in our language, but also use language that's honest and truthful, but also uplifts and empowers instead of brings people down. And as you've learned in these sessions on the social model of recovery, in recovery housing, we are always seeking to both reflect reality, but also to uplift and empower our residents as a part of the social model of recovery. And so just to explore this a little bit further, I have kind of a discussion question for you. So go ahead and locate the questions box and type in your answer to this question. So how do you feel when someone tells you that something is mandatory? So go ahead and put your answer in the box. All right, somebody said they feel pressured. Forced. Yep, somebody said they feel forced. Somebody said they feel powerless. Somebody else says they feel like they don't have a choice. They don't have a choice. And somebody else said they feel a sense of urgency and anxiety. And so these are all, really, these are all really good things that, to talk about. Somebody else said, yeah, they have no voice in the process whenever somebody says that something is mandatory. And someone else said pressured. Yes, that's right. So those are all feelings that, whenever we use those types of words in our policies and procedures, that's how, residents might feel, just like how we might feel whenever somebody's like, hey, this is mandatory, you have to do it. And I know for many of us, that's not really our intention to make residents feel that way. So I'm going to go ahead and ask a different question. And you can go ahead and use the chat box to type in your answer here as well. So on the reverse side, how do you feel when somebody asks you to agree to do something? Yep, somebody said they feel more open to it simply because they asked. Two people said empowered, and somebody said less restrictive. Oh, this is true. Somebody said like they want me to say yes, but I feel like I still have a choice, which is true. Depending on who's asking you to agree to do something, you may still feel that that pressure, but you certainly feel like you do have a choice. Somebody said like that I don't have an option. So some people, again, depending on who's asking you, you may still feel like, hey, it's not a real choice. They might be asking me, but there's still a real choice. So we said uplifted, and so that's good. And so we can see here that, just in these two simple ways of phrasing things, how that lands with us, when we're presented with two different options, either this is mandatory, you must do it, or hey, I'm going to ask you to agree to do something. And what our initial gut reaction is, and what our feelings and our emotions are when we're in that space. And so now for many of us, taking out from what we're feeling, when we're writing policies and procedures, I know what goes through a lot of our heads. What our utmost priority is making sure, that we're understood, right? So when we're writing out policies and procedures, we're thinking about the seriousness of the situation. We're thinking about, man, things have to work really well in order for everyone to be safe, in order for everyone to have what they need. And so we're going to write this out, and we want we want to be crystal clear what's going on. And we also are trying to use really strong language sometimes, not because we want to make people anxious or make people feel forced or involve all of those emotions, but it's our intention instead to make people take things seriously. And so, this is just a situation where sometimes our language, when we think about our intentions, our intention is we want you to take this seriously. We want you to understand how important it is, and we want you to understand what we're saying. But instead, what happens is people, instead of hearing that message, they're hearing, oh, I don't really have a choice. I have no power here. And instead, they might just shut down and be like, okay, I'll just agree to whatever because I really don't have a choice. And they're not hearing that message of it's important and we want you to understand what's going on. And so for us, our inclination is to use language like mandatory, required, under no circumstances. And however, what we often see is this language is not effective in helping us create the environment that we want. And as we see from our previous questions, when people see this language, their first reaction is often not, gee, I better take this seriously or I may get hurt. Instead, it creates an environment where people may experience feelings like helplessness, fear, or lack of control over their environment. And so to promote the social model, we want to promote empowerment, engagement, safety, and resident interaction with their environment. And so through carefully monitoring our words we use, we can ensure that residents both understand the importance of our policies while also maintaining those essential elements of the social model. And so first, examining our language comes about promoting bias. And so words like addict, former addict, or abuse, or even using words like clean and dirty, like those are very common words still in in this space. And and even residents themselves might use those words. But for your policies and procedures, you can still be honest and truthful in your words. It's not about sugarcoating anything. It's not about being dishonest, but choosing words that promote dignity and do not make value judgments for residents. So instead of using terms like addict or former addict, you can use terms like person in active addiction or person in recovery, and talk about, harmful use or substance-free or not substance-free. These terms are less likely to promote inappropriate bias for people in recovery, and, again, not to sugarcoat, not to be dishonest, but it's a way that we're taking the value judgment out of the language and instead, just talking about things the way they are without those value judgments. So that way people can know that they're still people of worth and value, and they're not being, morally judged for being a person with a substance use disorder. And of course, the language in this area is constantly evolving, and it's not a bad thing. As a society and culture shifts, so does the language we use. There are certainly terms and words that people used, 50 years ago to describe whole bunches of groups of people that are very inappropriate for us to use today. It just happens. And so just like we want to keep up on the latest technology and we want to have the most recent smartphone, tablet, or computer, we also need to make sure we're keeping up with our language and are up to date on what the best language is to use. So we wouldn't want to use a computer that was built in the 80s to do our jobs today. So in the same way, we don't want to use language that's from the 80s in order to effectively do our jobs today. We want to build and grow and make sure that we're using things that are the most relevant to our current culture and our current understanding. Also, there is much confusion between recovery housing and treatment. And especially in the state of Ohio, this is something that's being examined very closely. And so it can help you as an recovery housing organization to make sure that the language that you're using throughout your program and to describe your services is reflective of a housing environment rather than a treatment setting. And this is especially important for those of you who may be offering clinical treatment services, but then have a separate recovery housing program. Just so there's no confusion about where your clinical treatment services take place, and that your recovery housing program is separate from a treatment setting. So for example, in the housing world, we use terms like units and capacity, supports instead of treatment, applications instead of assessments. And then when you're talking about the process of people moving in and moving out, call that moving in and moving out instead of intake or admission or discharge. So those are all things that, again, that language promotes more of a housing type setting rather than a treatment setting. And then also we refer to residents of recovery housing as residents and as tenants because that is what they are. They're not clients or patients. And so just, using that language can make it really clear, to your residents, to the state, to your community, that this isn't a treatment center, this isn't a clinical setting, this is a separate, recovery housing setting, and it's a housing environment, and the people who live there have all of the rights and protections that individuals have in a housing environment. So harking back to our previous training on addressing NIMBY issues, this is a good strategy for addressing NIMBY issues. Just be very careful and be like, it is housing. And so we're using language that's promoting housing so that way you can be effective in educating and informing people about the fair housing rights of your residents. And then finally, as we discussed, when phrasing matters when it comes to the social model. And thanks to our sister state agency for help with developing this slide. And there's also a handout in the handout section that's from the Tennessee Alliance of Recovery Residences, which is our sister state agency in the state of Tennessee. And they created this helpful document to really look at those types of things that we went over earlier. So instead of using phrasing like must, mandatory, prohibited, or zero tolerance, phrasing things in I statements where the resident agrees to uphold policies and procedures. So for example, instead of stating that something is prohibited, phrase it as a statement where a person agrees to refrain from participating in specific activities. And instead of invoking potential feelings of helplessness, there's more of a feeling of participation and agreement. And of course, yes, you can always be very clear about what will happen if residents make certain choices. So yes, people have a choice, but they know what will happen if they make certain choices. So if you have a phrase where, hey, you agree to uphold the drug and alcohol-free living environment, and then they know that if they choose not to do that, what will happen and how that will be handled, and they agree that that's how things will be handled if they make that choice. And so, for example, here, weekly house meetings are mandatory. And of course, who looks forward to a mandatory meeting? No one. I know I usually don't. And so instead of saying that house meetings are mandatory, you can say, I agree to attend all weekly house meetings. And then they know that it's on them to show up for their own recovery, and that they are making the commitment to do this for themselves instead of doing it just to please you or to please anyone else. And we know that that's a big part of recovery as well, is that empowerment and knowing that this is about helping people understand that they need to show up for themselves in their own recovery, and that, and that when they do these things, they participate in these activities. It's not just about, I'm doing it because Danielle told me to, but I'm doing it because I understand that it's important for my recovery and I'm committed to my recovery. So I'm going to pause here to see if there are any questions about language or anything else that I've gone over so far. Okay, I am not seeing any questions, but certainly if you have them, go ahead and type them into that box. I will be pausing throughout to, also try to keep my eye on the box too to see if any new ones come in. So type them in and I will certainly get to them. And so the next section of our objectives that we're going to talk about are resident rights. Your resident rights statement is a critical document that helps you implement the social model of recovery. It is different than your list of house rules. This is the document that explains to the resident what rights they have while living in the house. So while you are going to have residents agree to do certain things and behave in a certain way in your code of conduct, you as the operator are also going to do that as well. This statement is about what you are agreeing to uphold to ensure a positive recovery environment. So again, under the social model, it's about empowerment and it's about residents understanding that, this goes two ways. Like they have to agree to uphold certain things, but then you as the operator, you're also going to respect their rights and you are going to take certain actions to make sure that they have a safe, clean, and healthy and supportive living environment. And a resident should be able to read this document and know that they are a person of worth and value, that they are participating in a program that is in compliance with all federal, state, and local laws, and that they're going to be treated with dignity and respect. So I am going to ask you a poll question here. So give me a second to launch it. Okay, so the poll question should be on your screen. Where should you reference your resident rights statement? So what other policies and procedures do you think reference your resident rights statement? Your resident agreement, your grievance policy, your staff code of conduct, or all of the above? I'm going to give you another 10 seconds or so to answer. Okay, you guys are very smart. All of the above. And I asked this question as a poll question just to get your juices flowing about things like your resident rights statement. It's helpful to have, one statement that you create and that people sign so everyone agrees to it, and then you reference that throughout, other documents so you don't have to keep recreating the wheel. So in your resident agreement, that's an agreement between you and your resident. You can reference, the resident rights statement. Certainly your grievance policy. Residents file grievances when they feel like their rights have been violated, and so they can, so you want to reference the statement of residents' rights there. And certainly your staff code of conduct, especially for our level 3 organizations. Staff have a role in making sure that resident rights are respected. And so having a place in the staff code of conduct where staff agree, to uphold those rights of the residents is important. So there's just a way to make sure you're thinking about your resident rights statement, that it's not something that, you just create and then put in a drawer, but it really is referenced throughout a lot of your other policies and procedures, which is why it's one of the first things that we go over in the Recovery Housing Institute. And so for many of you, you might need a sample policy to get you started. And there is a sample resident rights document in the Recovery Housing Development Guidebook. And for me, I know it's always tempting to use a template or a sample because it's written out for you already, but please use caution, especially the template that we have. It was pulled directly from Ohio Revised Code language, so it's written in a lot of legalese. And so I would highly recommend that you use that as kind of a guidepost, but really develop your own and talk to your residents about it, talk to your community partners about it. And you want to make sure you go through each element of the resident rights statement carefully and ensure that you understand it. Having a misunderstanding on these rights can cause you a great deal of harm in the future. So, yes, go ahead, use the templates and make appropriate adjustments, but just really do it in a way that you ensure that you, your staff, your residents, everyone's got a good understanding of the resident rights statement, because if there is a misunderstanding, that could not be a good thing. And we certainly, again, we like the use of templates, but as the social model, you want to engage your community and engage others in the development of these foundational documents. So it really is a helpful, good exercise to get your community engaged, to have them be involved in creating some of these foundational documents for your organization, especially if you're brand new, just starting out. Getting them involved is a good way to to demonstrate the social model from the very beginning in your recovery housing program. There's also a worksheet in the handout section that you can use to complete your homework assignment to help you develop your resident rights statement. And so we hope you use this worksheet as you develop your own statement. And if your community creates a statement themselves instead of using a template, there'll likely be more buy-in and understanding, making it easier for you to implement your policies in the long run. And so walking through this worksheet, so if you want, you can download it and open it up on your screen and see it as I walk through it. One consideration that you have when developing resident rights statement is considering what rights residents have under the law. There are rights that all residents have that are legally provided to them. So whether you disclose them or not in your resident rights statement, they have these rights. And as an organization that meets quality standards, you let them know, hey, you have these rights. And as an above board organization that meets standards, we're agreeing to uphold these legal rights. And these rights include fair housing rights, so the right to non-discrimination, landlord-tenant rights, as well as reasonable accommodations for people with disabilities. And we have a session later in this institute that dives specifically into these rights and the types of policies and procedures that are recommended for respecting these rights. I could go on for another hour about these in particular. That's why we divided that out into its own session. So please sign up for that session for way more detail about these particular legal rights of residents. But certainly for your resident rights statement, you're going to want to mention like, hey, these are your legal rights. We're an organization that's in compliance with all of the laws, and so we will respect these rights for you. And certainly take time to consult with your community to learn if there are other legal rights that you should be aware of and agree to uphold for your residents. So for some cities, there's additional fair housing rights that people might have, or there might be, for your particular community, depending on your target population, there might be additional rights that you want to be sure to mention and to let your community know that you are aware of. Also in your resident rights statement, think about things that you as an operator are committed to creating a safe and healthy environment. What do you need to do every day to make that happen? And so this includes things like treating residents with dignity and respect, informing residents of all available services and supports, ensuring each resident has their financial information explained to them. And that includes providing people with copies of receipts and statements of account upon request, so they can know exactly how much money they owe, how much money they paid, and if they have a balance, and when that balance is due, and what their payment plan is for that balance. Also ensuring a clean, safe, healthy, and home-like environment. And so again, take time with your community to brainstorm other commitments that you're going to make to ensure that residents always have a positive recovery environment. And then think about things that should never happen in recovery housing. So certainly that's a question you should ask yourself. Like, what are the things that we're going to prevent from happening in recovery housing? What are the things that people have the right to be free of while they are in recovery housing? And so this includes things like the right to be free from abuse, neglect, or exploitation, the right to be free from restraint or seclusion, the right to be free from financial exploitation. You can consider other rights, such as the right to be free from discrimination, free from violence, free from, any other of those elements. So that way people know, like, hey, while I'm living in this house, these are things that are not going to happen to me, and I have the right to be free of them while I am living in this house. Also, the other way to think about resident rights is to think about what residents are always going to be allowed to do. So what are you never going to prohibit a resident from doing? So as a recovery house, you cannot prohibit a resident from engaging in certain activities. And just again, things for this include filing a grievance. You're never going to stop a resident from filing a grievance if they have one. They always have the right to file a grievance in accordance with your house's policy, and that's how that grievance will be handled. But they do have that right to file a grievance. A right to seek medical care. So again, you're not the one providing the medical care, but a resident always has the right to go and seek appropriate medical care if they need it in the community, and you will not prevent a resident from doing something like going to the doctor or going to the dentist when they need to. Also, you will not prevent a resident from seeking their own legal advice or counsel. And of course, you can highlight that this can be at their own expense. That's, they don't have a right to have counsel provided to them by your organization. But if they want to go out and hire a lawyer or go to a legal aid agency, they have the right to go do that. And your organization would not prohibit them from doing that. Right, so again, there's a worksheet in the handout section that goes through each of those topics, and it's designed in a way for you to sit down with your community, your board, if you do have current residents, if you have others you have in your formation committee for your recovery home, for you guys to sit down and go through that document and to come up with your resident rights statement. And then after you complete that worksheet and you draft your resident rights statement, you can turn that into us, and we can we can look at it and provide any guidance and feedback for you to incorporate. And so here I'm going to pause again to see if there are any questions on resident rights statement. Okay, I am still not seeing any questions, but certainly if you have them, you can drop them in the question box. Okay, so now that we have discussed resident rights, we can discuss house rules and codes of conduct. At minimum, this code of conduct should clearly state that the use and possession of illicit drugs and alcohol is prohibited. And I know sometimes people will turn in resident house rules, codes of conduct to us, and nowhere in it is any statement about prohibited use of illicit drugs and alcohol, or residents agreeing not to use illicit substances or alcohol. And I ask them about it, and people will tell me, well, it's a recovery house, that's obvious. And certainly something that I want you to take away from this session, or all of our sessions on policies and procedures, is that even though it seems obvious, you still need to put it in writing and document it. So even though everything you're doing in your recovery home is about maintaining that drug and alcohol-free living environment, it's still important to put in your code of conduct that residents are going to agree to not use or possess illicit drugs or alcohol. And that includes using illicit substances or consuming alcohol when they are away from the home. So that needs to be clear. It's not just about what happens in the home, but also about their behavior in the community and them returning to the home. And I did get a question in, are there best practices for getting residents involved with creating resident rights? And should there be a committee of residents, or should we consider all the residents' involvement? And that depends on your organization. I know some people have very large organizations, and so for that, a committee might be more appropriate to have residents like select to be on a committee. Or if it's a super huge organization, maybe people can even vote for their representatives to be on the committee, this resident leadership committee or resident input committee. And and again, for a smaller organization, it just might make sense if you have just 5 residents that at a house meeting, you all sit down and this is an activity you do at a house meeting. For a bigger organization, you might form a committee and have residents volunteer or somehow be elected to sit on the committee. And certainly also for larger organizations, input might just be, hey, the committee drafted the resident rights statement, and now at a house meeting, you're going to have an opportunity to review it. And here's a survey or an email where you can provide feedback. So that way people can choose, their level of involvement. There's really no wrong way to do it. And I know each organization is different. They have different resources, different size, all of that. So those are ideas that you can use and pick from in order to find what works for your organization. All right, so back to our code of conduct. To meet the quality standards, so again, listing that residents agree to not use or possess those drugs and alcohol. Also list any items that are not allowed in the home. So for many, this list includes things like drug paraphernalia and other associated items, but you might also want to think about things, other items that, you know, just promote an attitude around active addiction versus a life in recovery. And so really thinking about those things, also thinking about safety things. So things like weapons and items of that nature, you know, really consider that. And if there are items that you're like, hey, I'm going to agree not to have these in the house. And then you're also required to address any rules related to your neighborhood. And of course, each recovery house is different. So you might, you might be out in the country and parking is not a problem. But for many recovery homes that are in the suburbs or in the city, parking can be an issue. And so you might want to be sure to list in your house rules or code of conduct, you are only permitted to park in the driveway or in the space directly in front of the house. Don't park across the street in front of the neighbor's house because they'll get mad, you know, all of those things. So just be clear about any of those items. And then finally, NAR standards require that the House Code of Conduct address smoking. It is your choice. The property can either be smoke-free, so you do not allow smoking anywhere on the property, or you can have a designated outdoor smoking area that is the designated area for smoking. Basically, we need you to be clear that smoking should not be taking place inside the building, and that includes basements and attached garages. You know, we don't, because again, if the basement lights on fire, the whole house lights on fire. If the attached garage lights on fire, the whole house is likely to light on fire. So it's a fire safety issue for when it for NAR, and so that outdoor designated smoking area can be wherever you like it, but it does need to be outside, and you need to be clear with people that there is no smoking inside in your house code of conduct. And so again, there's a worksheet in the handout section that we're going to go over together, and we hope to follow a similar process with your community when you're developing your house rules. And I see someone here has asked a question about candles, and yes, so that would definitely be something that you would put into your code of conduct. If your organization doesn't want residents to use candles and you want them to agree not to have items with an open flame for fire safety purposes, yeah, that is something that would go in the handout section. And so just walking through this worksheet, you know, you can download a copy. Under the social model, residents in recovery housing are not only there to receive support, but to give it. And we recognize that residents have valuable knowledge from their own lived experience and are to be developed into leaders during their stay in recovery housing. And also residents interact as the functionally equivalent family within the recovery home. And we've already discussed that recovery housing is housing and not treatment. And so therefore it's up to residents themselves to ensure that the code of conduct is upheld and enforced. And so while we're going to go over and talk about, you know, elements that are included in the recovery housing, it's also something that you need to keep in the back of your mind, where these are things that residents are also going to help you uphold. So people are going to look out after one another. You know, they're going to be the ones kind of monitoring the environment along with you. So that way, you know, it's an environment that's theirs. They take ownership for it, and they're the ones agreeing, you know, not only to support themselves, but also to support others within the home and create that safe and supportive environment. And so keeping that in mind, you know, we've got this developed kind of in the same way as the resident rights statement, where there's a series of questions in the worksheet that you to go over as a community and think about like what things residents should agree to in order to uphold the recovery housing environment. And so the first question is, what do you, oops, I skipped forward, accident. Here we go, sorry about that. So our first question is, what do residents commit to in order to maintain an environment that is free from illicit drugs and alcohol? And so for us, when we look at this, and here again, these are our ideas. You and your residents may have other ones. In residents and in their code of conduct will commit first and foremost, they're not going to use alcohol or illicit drugs, they're not going to possess alcohol or illicit drugs, they're not going to have alcohol or illicit drugs within the house. Also, they're going to agree to follow your home's medication policy. And yes, we're going to have an entire session on medication policies, but for your house code of conduct, of course, keeping the house environment free from illicit drugs and alcohol means that people are going to agree to uphold that policy. Also, this means issues around visitors and overnight guests. So you're going to have a policy on visitors and the conduct of visitors, and you're going to have a policy on overnight guests. And for many, like overnight guests that are not someone's minor children, people agree not to have those types of guests. So in many recovery homes, there's policies so that way parents can have their children come spend the night with them, but other overnight guests, the residents agree not to have those within the house for this reason of maintaining this environment that is free from illicit drugs and alcohol. And then also this is where you have your reoccurrence of use policies. You know, again, we're going to have an entire session on developing those, but for your code of conduct, you're going to have residents explicitly agree to uphold that policy, as well as your drug screening policies. And so these are all things that residents will agree to in your code of conduct, and you and your community might think of others in order for them to say, hey, this is what we are going to do to make sure that the house is free from alcohol and illicit drug use. And the next question that we ask in the on the worksheet and that your community can answer as a community is, what healthy habits and behaviors should residents commit to in order to promote recovery? So yes, we're agreeing to have a drug and alcohol free living environment, and there's certain things we're going to do to make sure that there's no illicit drugs or alcohol within the house, but we also need to think about, okay, well, what habits are we going to promote and what behaviors are we going to do to not only, keep drugs and alcohol out, but actively promote recovery? And so these are just, again, some examples of things here that are in codes of conduct that can do that, and your community might think of more. And so certainly being home at a certain time, so having a curfew, that actively promotes that sense of recovery, where people again help people keep track of one another, and they know, like, hey, I have to be home at a certain time or else others in the house are going to worry about me. Have people be on a schedule, like that really promotes a sense of recovery and commitment to recovery by being home at a certain time. So having everyone agree to uphold a curfew. People are also actively going to attend meetings. And so this can be whatever, meetings they choose, whatever works for your individual house and program. Many people, when they first move in, they have to attend a lot more meetings. And then as time goes on, they agree to still attend meetings, but maybe just not as many. People also agree to actively engage in their recovery plans. So this is another thing that residents will agree to in their code of conduct, and we'll have a whole nother session on recovery plans as well. And then also for some recovery homes, again, look at your particular program, but they may have requirements around seeking and maintaining employment. So programs can certainly request that residents agree to seek or maintain employment while they are living in the recovery home. And the next question to ask is, what should residents commit to in order to maintain a healthy household? So beyond just being illicit drug and alcohol free, looking at the physical environment. Again, it's their home. They're living there, and they are keeping it nice, not only for themselves, but for their housemates, as well as future people who may live in the house after they leave. So what are things that you want them to do, or that they agree to do, to make sure that that home is well maintained and that everything is healthy for others? So that means things like doing house chores, cleaning up after themselves, agreeing to wash their hands, and participate in basic hygiene, just so that the entire household has a safe and healthy household. And then another question to ask is, what should residents commit to in order to maintain a harmonious environment? And so we've talked about, drug and alcohol free. We've talked about, physical house safety, about what you're going to do to promote your recovery. But a big part of recovery housing is also just making sure that people get along with one another. And this can certainly be, something that's different from house to house. And so it's really a good idea to ask residents or past residents about these factors, and it can also depend on the makeup of your house as well. And so here too, for us, it's really important that you have, that you consider things like appropriate boundaries with staff and other residents. Another requirement from NAR is that you're very clear that staff cannot lend or borrow money from residents. They can't lend money to, they can't borrow money from residents, and they also can't lend or borrow items or things of value. So no allowing residents to borrow your car for a month or something like that, or giving residents a car. Like those are things that are prohibited. To establish those boundaries, and in your code of conduct is a good place to put that. So in your staff code of conduct, your resident code of conduct, just to be clear that, hey, there's going to be some boundaries here. And then think about other ways that you want to establish appropriate boundaries between the staff and the residents. What other things like romantic relationships, what's going to be that you're going to have your staff agree to in the staff code of conduct, as well as your residents agree to in the resident code of conduct. Also, this is the other place where you're creating a harmonious environment for residents amongst each other. So having things about treating each other with respect, treating other residents with respect, and not stealing items from other residents, what language is appropriate for residents to use in the house. And then also any policies that you might have about sharing items or borrowing items among residents, just again, to help keep that harmonious environment. And so here too might be a good place, especially when it comes to food, where you have in your code of conduct about people agreeing about, not to eat each other's food. If you put your name on it, it's theirs. A lot of strife happens with food in recovery housing. And so you want to, again, include that in your code of conduct. And that's certainly something, again, that is helpful to have resident input on, because they will certainly tell you what they want everyone to agree to do in order to keep everybody in the house getting along. And so this is a part too where I want to pause for a second and talk about equity advancement. And we know that a vast majority of our recovery housing organizations have it in their plans to advance equity within their programs. And it's a big deal for us as ORH to advance equity in recovery housing. And so this means creating supportive environments for all people who choose to enter recovery housing. And for many of us, we talk about resident rights and non-discrimination, which are really, really important. But we also want to go beyond just non-discrimination and to have policies, procedures, programming that is welcoming and that advances equity. And so to help create environments that are supportive of people who identify as LGBTQ+, it is a good idea to include in your code of conduct that while they are living in your recovery home, residents will use a person's appropriate name and pronouns. And so people can identify themselves with their name and the name that they wish other people to use for them, as well as their pronouns. And just being very clear that as a part of respecting other residents within the home, that they agree that they will use that person's name and they will use that person's pronouns. And this is especially important if somebody changes their name, or if they change the pronouns that they choose to use while they're living in recovery housing, that people agree that they're going to be respectful of that in order to advance equity. And having this in your code of conduct from the beginning really helps in case, there might be a situation where somebody does change their name or change their pronouns, and now everyone's, knows what the expectation is from your organization, because they knew about that when they moved in. You don't have to create a brand new policy around it or make a big deal out of it, because it's been there from the beginning. And then you can also have all residents agree not to use racist language or display racist symbols. That is also something that, again, you want to be clear about from the beginning about your organization's policies around anti-racism, and making sure that you have in your policies and procedures and in your code of conduct that residents will agree not to use that language within the recovery home, and they're also not going to display racist symbols or promote racism in your recovery home. And then finally, we want to think about the neighborhood. And so again, we go back to this as well. What do residents need to do in order to be good neighbors? And so things to think about here are parking rules, more important in some communities than others. General upkeep of the property, what are they going to do to upkeep the property, language and noise. And then also things about sidewalks. Something else I should add here too is some people have policies on on where residents can smoke, or hanging out on the front porch versus in the backyard. Just considering all of those things so that way recovery houses are good neighbors, and making sure those are in your code of conduct as well. And so that you have your ideas written out and you've gone through your whole worksheet with your community, look at each item and ask yourself, how does this rule support residents or create a community of recovery? And also think, is there a way you can simplify this and make it less cumbersome? And so an example here is, I agree to maintain a clean environment, including making my bed, cleaning my bathroom, washing dishes promptly after use, and disposing of trash in appropriate receptacles. So for many of you, your statement around maintaining a clean environment may look different. You can phrase it a little bit differently, but maybe making the bed isn't as big of a deal in your house, but you want to be specific enough so people know what you're expecting, but also, you not go crazy. And so for some people, you may say, I agree to participate in the chores assigned to me on the chore chart, and then you have your rotating chore chart. Whatever works within your recovery housing environment. And so for us, when we take a look at these rules, when we're reviewing them for ORH, we always look at them and think like, hey, is this actively promoting the recovery environment? And so for this particular rule, it's obvious how this promotes an active recovery environment. We know having a clean and safe environment is empowering for residents. Residents develop life skills, and we know there's often conflict around chores. And so we witness residents as they resolve that conflict amongst themselves when it comes to chores. And so we see that family-like atmosphere when it comes to chores in recovery housing and how residents agree to get those done. So it's very obvious to us how that supports your positive recovery environment. But sometimes, there are rules that are developed probably due to a specific situation or circumstance, and we're not really sure, what the whole point is, or if a rule was created just to address one particular topic. So for example, residents may not listen to music at the recovery home unless it's approved by the operator. I don't know what happened there in that particular circumstance, but we're like, hey, this seems a little extreme. What's the explanation here? And so this one sounds more like there was an issue with a particular resident where they were listening to music that other people didn't like, or maybe it was too loud or something of that nature. And the operator got frustrated, was like, fine, no one's listening to music unless I say it's okay. And so instead, we might think about what's a better way of phrasing, this type of rule to still create that harmonious environment, but not have it be so restrictive that people need to get pre-approval before listening to music. So for instead, you might change this to be like, I agree to listen to music at a reasonable level and to use headphones after 10 p.m. So that way residents can still listen to their music, but they know it's got to be at a reasonable noise level. And then at night, when other people are trying to sleep, they have to use headphones. So those are things that we can, we're looking at rules, and you're looking at them. You want to really think like, okay, make sure this isn't in response to just one particular circumstance, but it's going to work into the future. And so another best practice tip here is to examine is to examine and make sure that the things can be combined. So like I said, for example, instead of going through each chore, you can have residents agree to follow a daily posted chore chart, and that'll just simplify things for you. So instead of saying, I agree to take out the trash every week, I agree to put my dishes away every day, you can have a chore chart and list all those things in your chore chart, and then just in your code of conduct, you can remove a half a page of text by saying, I agree to follow the chore chart and do my daily chores. And then also have a separate policy and reference that policy for more complex policies. So again, things like your medication policy, you're probably going to have a separate policy for that. And so instead of listing it all out again in your house rules, you can just say, I agree to uphold the medication policy as outlined in the handbook. And that will, simplify things and make it easier to understand. And then that way, if you want to update your medication policy, you only need to update it in one place and you don't have conflicting policies. And so again, phrasing matters. Try as much as possible to use the social model oriented phrasing. I agree to, I commit to, for resident empowerment, and to make sure that residents, know and understand that they have an active role in their own recovery. And now many of you are probably wondering how this rules and codes of conduct differ across the levels of support. And so certainly in our level 3 environment, there is more support offered. So staff are present wherever residents are present, and residents have more support, such as buddy systems, structures run when visitors are present, sticking to a schedule. There might be more frequent screenings, all of that. And in level 2s, there's more flexibility. Homes may have a curfew system in place, but residents can get jobs, engage more with family. They can, and under specific circumstances and requirements, they can agree to have overnights away from the house, with their family and friends. They can build community relationships, and they certainly take on more leadership within the home. And at level 1, residents are developing the code of conduct really on their own. And so I suggest presenting them with the same list of questions that we just went through, and then working with them to develop their own code of conduct, within their own individual home. And so residents at a level 1 really need to be a point in their recovery where they can understand what supports they need and create that positive recovery environment. And so for us, that means they have at least 6 months in recovery before entering their level 1 home, or they've previously successfully stayed in a level 3 or level 2 recovery home, and the operator feels that they're ready for that level of support. I've got a final poll question for you. All right, here it is. Okay, all right. I messed up and I closed the poll way too early before any of you could vote. So I am sorry about that. But the poll question was, when is appropriate to reference immediate termination of residency? And I hope many of you know this answer, and I apologize for clicking the button too fast on the poll. But the answer is only in instances of where there's an immediate threat to health and safety. And so, of course, we want there to be discussions. We want there to be people to uphold the code of conduct. But when you were talking about immediate termination from recovery residences, that really should only be happening if there's an immediate threat to health or safety. We do not want to take someone and exit them into homelessness for things like not making their bed, or for not putting their dishes away, or because they said something that might have been, offensive, but it wasn't, a threat to health or safety. And so really we want to see that you have policies and procedures in place, that if someone's not following the code of conduct, it's an opportunity for discussion, perhaps some connection to additional supports and services to help them, and then have that opportunity to be develop shared understanding of why the elements of the code of conduct are important. And so again, here just reiterating that it's not appropriate to threaten eviction for noncompliance with house rules unless it is unless it is an immediate threat to health or safety. And the social model depends on resident involvement. And so be sure to share both your draft resident rights as your code of conduct with your resident committee, alumni, your current residents. And if you're new, you can share this document with people who had previous experience with recovery housing, and you can review these documents on a regular basis. So again, as the world changes, so do we need to change. And so it's a good idea to make sure that your policies and procedures remain clear and that they're relevant. And so again, for example here, 20 years ago, cell phones were not as prevalent as they are today. 10 years ago, I don't know how many years ago, but 10 years ago, probably social media was not what social media is today. And so you might think about, like, how are those impacting the environment within the recovery home, and are there codes of conduct and things that you might have around cell phones, around use of social media, especially when it comes to privacy, and what residents should be posting and things on social media. And so those are things that you might want to think about as an organization. And of course, as the world evolves and changes, so do we need to evolve and change, to respond to those things that are happening outside of our houses. And now when a resident moves into recovery housing, it's a busy time. And many times there are issues where you're having those difficult conversations and people say, well, I just didn't understand that that's what your policy was. And it's because when they move in, they're stressed, they're going through so much paperwork, or they just might be so desperate for housing that they're just going to sign and agree to anything because they need a place to stay. And so we really recommend that when you're going over your house rules, when residents are moving in and your resident rights statement, just to make sure that resident needs are met. Have a current resident available to answer questions. Really take the time and have that resident read the statements out loud. Again, if they're reading it, then you can kind of be there and see if they're understanding it fully, or if they have questions, and really allow them that time. And so again, for things like your resident rights and your house rules, we really recommend having one single statement and then referencing that statement across, your other policies and procedures. And have residents sign these, and it's a requirement under our quality standards as well to have these documents be signed by residents, so that way we know that they've received them, they understand them, and you can keep a copy of that within their file. And for us as well, I know how difficult it is, where we've seen situations where people have one statement of resident rights that's posted on the refrigerator, there's one that's in the handbook, and there's one that's included with the grievance policy, and they're all different. And now there's a grievance, and each person who's reviewing that grievance is looking at a different document. And that's not comfortable, because it's all different, and everyone in that situation is right and everyone in that situation is wrong. And so we really, would hope that you have one single statement, and you either make sure that it's the exact same across any place where you need to repeat it, or you refer to that one document. So that way, again, if you're ever in those situations, everyone can literally be on the same page, because all of the pages are the same. Okay, and I do think I have some final questions here. Are there any constraints that prevent organizations requiring residents to provide proof of registration or license for cars at recovery residences? And no, not from NAR. So for us at ORH, you can ask residents if they have a car on your property that they provide appropriate proof of registration, and that they have a driver's license, for that vehicle, or even appropriate insurance for that vehicle. So those are definitely things that you can require residents to do if they're going to have a car on your property. Yeah. Oh, and then somebody made a suggestion to encourage to hold others accountable, and that is certainly true. You can find a way to put that in your code of conduct, and we certainly have people put that in where they say, where they remind residents that it's a recovery environment and that it's not snitching when they bring up their concern for a fellow resident who might be needing more support. and say that so, and then let them know that it's up to you. If you notice someone who's struggling and needs more support, that this is that it's up to you to report that, and that you agree to do that when you have a concern about someone else in the house. So that's a great suggestion to include. And then somebody mentioned too that they tried to open the slides to download and it won't open. If you're having issues with the downloads, sometimes your computer firewalls might block that. You know, we will send out a copy of the handouts to everyone after the session, so you will get those in the next couple of days. So thanks for bringing that up. Apologies that the system isn't working appropriately. But if you want these handouts right now and you're going to use them within the next day, because I might not be sending that email out for another couple of days, and you do have them open, I recommend downloading them to your computer, because once I exit out of the webinar in just a couple minutes, the handouts will disappear. And if you don't save a copy to your actual computer, you won't be able to go back and get them. So if you would like to download those right now, please take a minute to do that. And I'm not seeing any other questions. And so we do have a homework assignment, and it is available for you in your handout section. So we would like you to create and revise if you have one that you want to revise, your resident rights statement, as well as your House Code of Conduct House Rules statement. And you can feel free to turn these into me. My email address is there, and we will provide feedback and get back to you. And if you incorporate all of that feedback, we suggest you keep that document in a separate folder. And then throughout all of these training series, if you do each assignment and you incorporate the feedback, you save the document in its own little folder. At the end of this series, that folder will contain all the documents that you need to submit your application for RH certification. So we encourage you to do that and to join us for future trainings. So I'm not seeing any final questions before we close out. I know I kept you guys a little bit over our time, and I apologize for that. But thank you so much for your time and your attention this morning. We hope you enjoyed today's webinar, and we look forward to seeing you on future webinars. Thank you.